The night Oliver Walker heard the knock at his door, he had not spoken a full sentence to another human being in 11 days, and the silence had grown so thick inside his cabin that he had stopped noticing it, the way a man stops noticing the weight of his own bones. It was the autumn of 1882, in the high desert country of New Mexico Territory, where the sage ran silver in the moonlight, and the mountains to the east turned the color of dried blood at sunset. Oliver's ranch sat on a shallow rise above Cutter Creek, 7 miles from the nearest town, which was a place called Dalton Flats, a rough collection of 14 buildings, a post office that doubled as a general store, a saloon that doubled as everything else, and a population of just under 200 souls who had learned, over the course of 8 years, to leave Oliver Walker entirely alone. He was 34 years old and looked older in certain lights. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, broad shoulders that had been useful once, and hands that still remembered how to work even when the rest of him had forgotten the point of it. His face was not an unkind face. It was simply a face that had been closed for a long time, like a window latched from the inside against weather that had already done its damage. He had 200 head of cattle, a horse named Sergeant who had forgiven him more than he deserved, and a dog, a red heeler named Dust, who slept under the porch in summer and inside by the cold stove in winter. He did not light that stove for company. He lit it for himself when the cold came down from the mountains and made the floorboards creak, and even then he sometimes let it go until morning because there was no one to mind whether he was comfortable. 8 years. People in Dalton Flats counted it quietly among themselves, the way they counted other things: the distance to the railroad, the price of beef, the number of winters since someone had died. Oliver Walker had come to this valley with a wife named Clara in the spring of 1874 when he was 26 and she was 24, and both of them had believed in the territory the way young people believe in things, completely, without evidence. Clara had planted a kitchen garden. She had put curtains on the windows. She had named the dog they had then, a shepherd mix called Pepper, and she had laughed at the sound of the coyotes in the evening, not afraid of them at all. Clara died in the summer of 1874, barely 3 months after their arrival. Childbed fever, after a birth that should not have happened so early, a boy who did not survive the night. The doctor came from 30 miles away and arrived too late, and said all the things doctors said when they arrived too late, and Oliver had stood in the doorway of the room he had built with his own hands and understood, for the first time in his life, that some losses do not heal. They scar. And the scar is so large that eventually you stop seeing anything else. He stayed because he had nowhere else to go, and because leaving felt like abandoning the ground she was buried in. He worked. He expanded the herd. He fixed the roof and built a second corral and replaced the fence posts along the north pasture twice. He was useful in practical ways and nothing else. The people of Dalton Flats admired him from a careful distance. Women had tried over the years gently, then with more resolve, then with the resigned acknowledgement that Oliver Walker was a man who had made up his mind about something, even if they weren't sure he knew what. He was never rude. He was never cold in any obvious way. He simply did not open the door all the way. He stood in the gap of it and spoke, and then closed it again, and eventually everyone stopped reaching for the handle. He had not lit the stove for company in 8 years. The knock came on the 15th of October, at the end of a day when he had spent 6 hours mending fence on the eastern pasture, and come home too tired to heat water for coffee, settling instead for cold biscuits left from 2 days before, and a long look at the fire he had not built. Dust lifted his head from beneath the table. The knock came again, not timid, not aggressive, but steady, like someone who had decided on something and was not going to undecide it. Oliver crossed the room in 4 strides and opened the door. She was standing on his porch in a blue dress that had been respectable once and had been through too much weather since. She had a canvas traveling bag at her feet, mud on her boots to the ankle, and hair the color of good mahogany that had come half loose from its pins, and was doing whatever it liked in the wind. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark eyes that caught what little light the lantern above the door offered and gave nothing back easily, and a mouth set in the expression of a person who is prepared to be turned away but has decided to ask anyway. "I am sorry to bother you," she said. "I was told in town that you might have work. I am Olive Alden. I can cook, I can mend, I can manage cattle if you need it, and I will sleep in the barn if that is the arrangement. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for honest employment." Oliver Walker stood in the door of his cold cabin and looked at Olive Alden, and something happened in the space behind his ribs that he had no name for, something that surprised him the way a sound surprises you when you have been sitting in silence so long you have forgotten the world makes sounds. He said, "Come inside." She looked at him. She had clearly been prepared for a different answer. He stepped back and held the door, and then, before she had finished stepping over the threshold, before she had set her bag down, before she had done anything more than look around the room with those dark, careful eyes, he was moving toward the stove. He had not lit it for company in 8 years. He had it going before she finished speaking. He crouched beside the iron stove and opened its door and laid kindling with the hands of a man who knew the work so well he didn't have to think about it. And he thought about it anyway, thought about the fact that he was doing it, that he had done it without deciding to. The way your hand pulls back from fire before your mind says move. He built the fire properly, with paper and dry pine and a split log of cedar over the top, and when he touched the match to it and felt the heat push back against his face, he was aware, without turning around, that Olive Alden was watching him. "Sit down," he said. "I will put water on." She sat in the chair near the table and placed her hands flat on the surface, and he noticed when he stood and turned that her hands were not the hands of a woman who had been idle. They were capable hands, a little rough at the knuckles, the hands of someone who had done real work in real conditions for a real number of years. "Where did you come from?" he said. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way he said most things, which was directly, without ornament. "Abilene originally," she said. "More recently from a ranch outside Magdalena. The man I worked for lost the property to the bank in August. I have been on the road since. On foot. I had a horse until 3 days ago. She came up lame on the mountain pass. I left her at a farm. The man there seemed decent." She paused. "I may be wrong about that." Oliver filled the kettle from the water barrel beside the door and set it on the stove, which was already beginning to breathe heat into the room. He could feel it, the difference in the air, the small loosening of the cold that had been sitting in the corners of the cabin for weeks. He was not sure he had noticed the cold particularly until this moment when it was beginning to leave. "How did you end up in Magdalena?" he said. "My husband died," she said. It was said plainly, without drama, the way people in those years said things that were terrible, because drama had not survived contact with the actual facts. 2 years ago. He was a rancher. When he died there was more debt than land, and I had to work. I have been working since." "I'm sorry," he said. "So am I," she said. "But that isn't why I am here." He looked at her directly then, really looked, and found that she was looking back with the same quality of directness, and it was strange and slightly unsteady, like walking on ground you expected to be frozen and finding it soft. "Tell me what you can do," he said. "I told you already," she said. "Cook, mend, manage cattle. I know how to put up preserves and how to stretch a flour barrel for 6 weeks. I know which end of a calf to pull when it's turned wrong. I can ride and I can rope and I can manage the books if you have trouble with figures. I don't have trouble with figures." "Then you don't need the books managed," she said. "The rest stands." He poured the coffee when the water boiled, and he set the cup in front of her, and she wrapped her hands around it like she had not been warm in some time, and maybe she hadn't. The stove was doing its work now. The cedar was burning down to coals, and the room was filling with a warmth that had a smell to it, a living smell, the smell of heat deliberately made for a person to sit in, and Oliver Walker was aware that this was something he had not done for 8 years and that he had done it in under 30 seconds without being asked. He sat down across from her. "You can have the work," he said. "The room at the back of the house, it's small but it has a proper door and a proper lock on it. I will pay you $30 a month plus your meals. You do not have to sleep in the barn." Olive Alden looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and for the first time something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but a slight easing, the way a person looks when they have been carrying something heavy and have been told they may put it down. "That is fair," she said. "I am going to need to know," he said carefully, "that you understand the arrangement. I am not a sociable man. I work the ranch. I do not want things to be complicated." "I am not here for complications," she said. "I am here because I need honest work." "Good," he said. "Good," she said. They drank their coffee in the warm room, and the fire in the stove burned steady, and outside the coyotes started up far away in the dark hills, and Olive Alden, who was not afraid of that sound, did not flinch when she heard it. The first week was workmanlike. Olive rose before the sun, the way people did when there was real work waiting, and had a proper breakfast on the table before Oliver came in from his first round of the morning chores. She had found the situation in the kitchen with the equanimity of a person who had dealt with worse. The stove was functional, the larder was underused, and there was enough in the root cellar to begin with if you were creative about it. She was creative about it. Oliver ate what she put in front of him. He said thank you every time, plainly and without elaboration, and she noted that he meant it, which was more than she had gotten from some employers. He did not ask her questions. She did not volunteer information. They moved around the cabin with the practiced efficiency of people who understood the value of space and the cost of getting in each other's way. By the third day, she knew the layout of the operation well enough to work independently, and she began to. She repaired the fence on the kitchen garden, which had been let go. She organized the storage in the root cellar and found a barrel of salt pork that had gone wrong and disposed of it before it could cause trouble. She took inventory of the grain store and made a list of what was needed from town and left it on the table, and when Oliver came in from the pasture that evening, he looked at the list for a long time. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know," she said, "but the situation needed doing." He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. "I will go to town on Friday." "I can go," she said. "If you'd rather not." He looked at her. "I will go," he said. "It's a long ride for a person who doesn't have a horse." "I had considered that," she admitted. His mouth moved at the corner just barely, and it was not quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing, and Olive looked at it and then looked away and told herself it was none of her business. On the fourth day she caught him watching her from across the yard as she worked with the horses, and when she glanced up he looked away with such unhurried ease that it might have meant nothing, except that nobody looks away from nothing with quite that much determination. She did not say anything about it. On the fifth day she found the graves. She had gone to the south side of the property, following the line of the garden wall to find where the water came from in the spring, and she came upon them almost before she saw them. 2 small wooden crosses side by side under a juniper tree, the ground around them carefully cleared of debris, the crosses themselves old but upright. She could not read the names from where she stood, and she did not walk closer. Some things declared themselves clearly enough. She went back to the kitchen and began preparing supper and did not speak of it, and something settled differently in her chest about Oliver Walker from that moment forward, a kind of understanding that was wordless but complete. On the 6th day he brought her a horse. He came in from town on Friday with the supply wagon, and tied behind it was a bay mare with a white blaze, stocky and sure-footed, about 7 years old. He let dust down from the wagon seat and began unloading the supplies without comment, and Olive came out of the kitchen door and stopped on the porch step when she saw the mare. "What is that?" she said. "A horse," he said. He didn't look up from the flour sack he was carrying. "Whose horse?" "Yours, if you want it. Bought it from Sam Heller at the livery. You need to be able to get to town on your own. It is not good to be that far from town without a way there." Olive looked at the mare, who was looking back at her with large, uncomplicated brown eyes. Then she looked at Oliver Walker, who had gone back to the wagon and was lifting a sack of cornmeal with his back to her. "Thank you," she said. "Her name is supposed to be Molly," he said, "but she doesn't seem to answer to it. You can call her what you like." Olive went down the porch steps and walked to the mare and put her hand on the warm side of the horse's neck. The mare dropped her head and breathed out, easy and accepting. "I will call her Hazel," Olive said. "Good," said Oliver, and carried the cornmeal inside. That evening after supper, which Olive had made into something remarkable with the fresh provisions from town, a stew with proper onions and a dried apple cake she had managed with what was in the larder, they sat at the table in the firelight, and Oliver poured 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it, and then sat for a moment with both cups in front of him, looking at them, before pushing one across to her. It was not a gesture he had made before, not for 8 years. He looked at it happen and said nothing. Neither did she. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the surface of the coffee and said, "Tell me about the cattle operation." "I would like to understand it fully so I can be useful to you," he told her. He told her more than he intended to, because she asked good questions, direct, specific questions that showed she understood what she was asking. And because the answers led to other things, the drainage problem in the north pasture, the dispute with the Renner brothers over the east fence line, the market price situation that had been making beef ranching difficult since the railroad came through to Socorro. He talked for an hour, and when he finally stopped, he was aware that it had been a very long time since he had talked that much about anything to anyone, and that it had not been unpleasant. "The Renner brothers," Olive said. "Which ones are those?" "2 of them, Wade and Carl. They're not bad men exactly. They're just certain they're right about a property line that the original survey did not support them on. It has been a standing argument for 3 years. Have you shown them the survey?" "Yes. And they dispute the survey. They dispute the man who did it." "Who did it?" "A man named Fowler who is dead." "Is there no other copy?" Oliver was quiet for a moment. "I have never asked if there is another copy," he said. "The county recorder's office would have one," Olive said, "if it was filed, which surveys of disputed property usually are. That seems like it would settle things." He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee cup. "That is a good thought," he said. "It is a simple thought," she said. "Sometimes those are the better ones." He laughed. It was a quiet sound, brief and a little surprised, and she looked up at it, and there it was again, that barely there movement at the corner of his mouth that had graduated into something more definite, and this time neither of them looked away quickly enough. The 2 weeks following were a kind of careful circling. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said yet. The work was the structure around which everything else arranged itself, and there was enough of it to keep them occupied and apart during the day, and enough of the evenings to bring them back together, which they both acknowledged by simply being in the room with the stove going and the coffee made. And gradually, the conversation between them stopped being entirely about cattle and fence lines. She told him about Abilene, which she had left at 19 when she married Thomas Alden, who had been a good man and a poor judge of land value, and who had done his best and died of a fever before he could fix the choices he had made. She said it without bitterness. She had sorted through the bitterness in the 2 years since and set most of it down. He told her one evening about Clara. He did not tell her everything. He told her enough the spring they had arrived, the kitchen garden, the curtains on the windows. He did not tell her about the birth. He was not ready for that. She did not press. She was not that kind of person, she said. She must have been somebody worth loving. "She was," he said. "It shows," she said, "in the way the place is kept. The graves are cared for. That says everything about a person." He was quiet for a while after that, and she let the quiet be, and they sat in the warm room, and the fire in the stove did what fire does, which is keep the darkness from getting all the way in. It was in the 3rd week of October that the trouble started with the Renner brothers, and it came at exactly the moment Oliver had gone to the county seat at Socorro to inquire about the duplicate survey record, which turned out to exist, which was satisfying but which also meant 3 days away from the ranch. He had not wanted to leave. He had gone back and forth about it and come down on the side of going because the survey matter needed attending to, and because he did not want to examine too carefully why the idea of leaving was suddenly complicated. He had told Olive everything she needed to know about the operation. He had shown her the rifles over the fireplace and told her how the latch on the north gate worked and made sure Dust was stationed on the porch and Hazel was in the near corral. He had stood in the yard on the morning of his departure and looked at the cabin and felt something he didn't have a word for, and then got on Sergeant and rode south. The Renner brothers arrived on the second day. They came in the afternoon, which was typical of people who wanted to make a point and knew that the man of the property was away. Olive had been in the garden taking up the last of the late turnips when she heard the horses and came around the corner of the cabin to find Wade Renner and Carl Renner sitting on horseback about 10 feet from the porch step, looking at the place with the proprietary ease of men who had decided something in advance. Wade was the older one, perhaps 45, with a beard that had gone gray in patches and eyes that were sharp without being particularly intelligent. Carl was younger and quieter and always seemed to be waiting for his brother to tell him what to feel. "Walk her around," Wade said. "He is not," Olive said. She had left the turnips. She was carrying the garden fork. "Who are you?" "I work here," she said. "Can I help you with something?" "We were just coming to check on the east fence," Wade said in the tone of a man saying one thing and meaning another. "Been some movement over there." "I am not aware of any movement on the east fence," Olive said. "And I would be since I have been checking the line twice a day." Wade Renner looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "That's so." "It is," she said. "And Mr. Walker has gone to Socorro to retrieve a document from the county recorder's office regarding the survey of the east property line. He will be back in 2 days." Something shifted in Wade's expression. It was not quite alarm, but it was in that neighborhood. "What document?" he said. "I believe you already know what document," Olive said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Renner." Wade Renner looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at Carl. Then he looked at Olive again, at the garden fork in her hand and the dog at her feet, and the general aspect of a woman who had been doing hard work in difficult conditions for long enough to have no patience for men who showed up uninvited to inspect other people's fence lines. "Good afternoon," he said, and the two of them turned their horses and rode back the way they had come. Olive stood in the yard and watched them go and then let out a breath she had not known she was holding, and Dust looked up at her and she said, "Yes, I know," and went back to the turnips. When Oliver came back on the third day, riding up the road from the south in the late afternoon with a rolled document in his saddlebag, and a look about him that was almost something like relief to see the cabin still standing and the smoke from the chimney, she was on the porch with coffee already poured. She told him about the Renner brothers and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "You told them about the survey. I thought it might discourage them from doing anything foolish before you got back," she said. "Was that wrong?" "No," he said. "That was right. That was exactly right." He sat down on the porch step and stretched out his legs and accepted the coffee. He was tired from the ride and there was dust on him, and he looked, in the low light of the autumn afternoon, like a man who had been out in the world and come back to somewhere specific, not just somewhere familiar but somewhere that was waiting for him. He looked up at her. She was standing with her own coffee, leaning against the porch post, and she was looking at the hills to the east where the light was going orange and deep red. "Did you eat while I was gone?" he said. "I ate," she said. "I am a grown woman. I know how to feed myself." "I know that," he said. "I was asking because I was concerned." She looked at him then. "I know you were," she said. "The survey settled the Renner dispute within a month. The document from the county recorder was unambiguous, and when Oliver Walker rode to the Renner property with the duplicate in hand and Carl Renner actually read it for himself, the argument largely collapsed. Wade held out on principle for another 2 weeks, and then the principle stopped feeling worth the energy. The fence line was established. The matter was closed. Oliver felt, for the first time in 3 years, that a thing had been properly finished. He told Olive about it at supper on the evening it was settled, and she said, "Good," in the particular way she had of saying things that were complete in themselves, no further decoration required, and he sat across from her in the warm kitchen and watched the lamplight on her face and thought about the night she had knocked on his door and how, at the moment he had turned to the stove, he had known something, though he would not have been able to say what. He was beginning now to be able to say what. November came with ice on the creek in the mornings and a cold wind out of the mountains that drove the cattle to the south pasture and kept Oliver and Olive working hard to make sure everything was properly prepared before the real winter settled. They worked alongside each other with a rhythm that had grown natural without discussion. He handled the heavy work with the herd. She managed the stores and the cabin and came out to help when an extra pair of hands was needed, which was often enough. They understood each other's working pace and did not get in each other's way and were, without having spoken about it, glad to be in each other's company. The evenings were long and the stove was warm and the conversations had moved well past cattle and fence lines. She had read more than he expected, because she had been a school teacher for a year before she married Thomas Alden, and she had kept the habit of reading when she could get books. He had a crate of them under the bed that she discovered while sweeping and exclaimed over, genuine and unguarded, the way people do when they find something they didn't expect to find. "You have Dickens," she said, holding up a battered copy of Great Expectations like it was something valuable, which it was. "It was my mother's," he said. "She sent it with me when I came west. Have you read it?" 3 times, he said. She looked at him and something warm moved in her expression. "Good," she said. "I was afraid you hadn't. Why would I keep something I hadn't read?" "You might," she said. "Some people keep books for the look of the thing, for the company of them, even unread." He thought about that. "My mother would have known if I hadn't," he said. "Is she still living?" "In Virginia," he said. "She writes in the spring and the fall when the mail is reliable." "Does she know about Clara?" "She was here for the burial," he said quietly. Olive set the book down gently on the table. "She sounds like a good woman." "She is the best woman I have ever known," he said, and then he stopped, because that was no longer entirely true, and he was not ready to say the thing that was more true now, but he was aware of it sitting in the room between them, visible and warm like the fire in the stove. She seemed to feel it too. She looked at the book cover and smoothed the edge of it with her thumb and did not say anything, and the silence was the particular kind that is not uncomfortable, but is full of something neither person has put into words yet. Oliver Walker was not a man who frightened easily. He had faced blizzards and droughts and financial ruin, and the kind of grief that makes you wonder why you are bothering to stay upright. But the feeling that was growing in him now, specific and undeniable, was frightening in a way none of those things had been, because it required something of him, not endurance, not practicality, but the opening of the door that he had latched from the inside for 8 years and held shut against all weather. He was afraid not that he would feel it but that she would leave, and that it would be worse than before, because before he had not known what he was missing, and now he was beginning to know precisely and completely. Olive Alden, for her part, had not come to Dalton Flats expecting anything except work, and she had found work, good honest work, and she had been grateful for it in the practical way of a woman who had known what it was to need it. She had not expected the cabin to feel like a place she belonged to. She had not expected the man in it to be someone she thought about when he was not in the room. She had spent 2 years being careful with herself after Thomas died, careful not to want things she wasn't sure she could have, not to attach to places that might not keep her, not to open anything she could not afford to close. She had been good at it. The moving from place to place had helped. When you don't have a fixed point, you can't be too fixed on one. But this place had a fixed point now, and she was aware of it in the way you are aware of the sun, not looking directly at it, but knowing exactly where it is. In the second week of November, she nearly told him. They had been working all day in the cold, bringing the last of the cattle through to the winter pasture, and she had been on Hazel for 6 hours and was tired in the deep way that good hard work makes you tired, and they had ridden back side by side in the early dark with their breath making clouds in the cold air. And when they came into the yard she had dismounted and Hazel had nudged her shoulder and she had laughed, and Oliver had been watching, and when she turned and found him watching, he didn't look away. He just looked at her in the almost dark for a long moment, and she looked back, and the thing between them was so present it was practically audible. Then Dust barked at something in the brush and broke the moment, and they both moved to put up the horses, and the moment dissolved the way moments do completely and without retrieving. Inside, over supper, they were quiet, not uncomfortably quiet. The fire was going and the food was good, and they ate with the ease of people who have been comfortable in silence together long enough that the silence is companionable. But there was a quality to the quiet that was different from the quiet of the early weeks, heavier with something unsaid, and Olive felt it in the back of her throat like the first taste of weather coming. After supper, when Oliver was washing his coffee cup at the basin, he said, without turning around, "Are you planning to stay through the winter?" She was quiet for a moment. "That depends on whether you want me to," she said. He turned then. He was holding the coffee cup and he was looking at her and he said, "I want you to stay, not just through the winter." Olive Alden looked at Oliver Walker across the kitchen of the cabin he had built with his own hands, and the fire was going in the stove that he had lit for her on the night she knocked on his door, and she said, "Tell me what you mean by that." "I mean," he said carefully, "that I would like you to stay because you are here and not because I need the work done. The work would get done. It got done before. I mean that the cabin is different with you in it, and I have been trying not to say that for a month, and I am not apparently capable of not saying it any longer." She stood up from the table and crossed the room to him, and she stood close enough that she could see the exact shape of the uncertainty in his face, the man underneath the careful closed expression, present and real and afraid in the specific way that people who have been hurt are afraid of things they want. "Oliver," she said. "Yes," he said. "I stayed for the work in the beginning," she said. "I did not stay for the work after the first week." He put the coffee cup down on the counter carefully and looked at his hands for a moment and then looked at her, and she thought she had never seen someone look so wholly present, so entirely in one place, as he looked in that moment. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, gently, with one of those capable work-roughened hands, and she put her hand over his and held it there. "I have been scared," he said, "of this, not of you, of this." "I know," she said, "I have been scared too." "What are you scared of?" "That it is temporary," she said. "I have gotten very good at temporary." "I am not interested in temporary," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "No, I don't believe you are." He kissed her then, not with urgency but with the care of a man who understands that some things are not to be rushed, who has been saving something for a long time without knowing it and is now giving it back to the world. It was a kiss that tasted like coffee and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of something that has been a long time coming. When he pulled back, he was still holding her face in his hands, and she was looking at him with eyes that were brighter than usual. "Stay," he said. "I am not going anywhere," she said. December arrived, and with it the serious cold, the kind that settled into the valley from the mountains and did not lift for days, turning the creek to iron and riming the fence posts white. They worked in it side by side, wrapped in wool and leather, and in the evenings the stove was the center of everything. The fire built properly, the room warm, the two of them close in the way that becomes natural when winter makes the world small, and the inside of a cabin becomes the whole world. Oliver had not noticed, consciously, how much he had been living with the lights turned low until someone showed him what it looked like with them fully on. There had been a quality to his days before Olive arrived that he had accepted as the normal nature of things, sufficient, functional, stripped of excess. The way he had stripped everything that reminded him of a time when he had hoped for more than survival. He had told himself this was wisdom. He understood now that it had been lost pretending to be wisdom, which is not the same thing and never was. He said this to her one evening, not in those exact words, because he was not a man who spoke in those exact words, but in the way he had of saying real things plainly, and she listened with her legs tucked under her in the chair by the stove and her head tilted and her dark eyes steady on him. And when he finished, she said, "You were keeping the wound from closing." "Yes," he said. "And did you know that?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. I thought the wound was supposed to stay open. I thought it would be a kind of betrayal if it closed." "Of Clara," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't think she would have wanted it to stay open." He looked at the fire. "No," he said, "she would not have. Clara was the kind of person who moved toward things. She was not afraid of hope." "She planted a garden in new country," Olive said. "That tells you everything." He looked at Olive then, and she was smiling a little soft and real, and he felt the scar shift in his chest, not disappear, because some scars are permanent and that is right and proper, but shift, make room, the way scar tissue can when it has healed enough to have some flexibility in it. "I want to do something," he said. "I want to ask your permission before I do it." She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." "It is serious," he said. He got up from his chair and went to the mantelpiece, where there was a small wooden box that had been there since Olive arrived and which she had never asked about because she had learned to let Oliver Walker show her things when he was ready. He picked up the box and opened it and took out a ring, a plain gold band, simple and honest, the kind of ring that says exactly what it means. "This was my mother's," he said. "She took off her wedding band after my father died and kept this one, the one she wore when she was a girl. She sent it to me the year after Clara died with a letter that said she was sending it forward, for when I was ready, because she believed I would be ready again someday." He stood across the room from her with the ring in his palm and said, "I have been carrying it for 8 years." Olive had unfolded herself from the chair and was standing now, her hands at her sides and her expression very still in the particular way that is not absence of feeling but the opposite. "Oliver," she said. "I know this is fast," he said. "In the terms of how these things are usually counted, this is fast. You have been here 2 months. 2 months and 4 days, she said. 2 months and 4 days, he agreed. But I am 34 years old and I have been carrying this ring for 8 years and I know my own mind, and I know that you are the reason I lit the stove again." He paused. "That is probably not the most eloquent proposal a woman has ever received." "It is the most honest one I have ever received," she said. She crossed the room and took the ring from his palm and looked at it, and then she looked at him. "You are asking me to stay permanently." "I am asking you to build something here," he said. "With me, whatever that looks like, whatever it becomes. I am not asking you to be in the shadow of anything that came before. I am asking you to be here in this as yourself." She turned the ring over in her fingers and then she held it out to him. "Put it on," she said. He took it and slid it onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her. And maybe there are things like that in the world, things that travel forward through time waiting for the right destination. He held her hand in both of his and looked at the ring on her finger, and when he looked up at her face she was already crying, quietly, without drama. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something you had stopped believing in shows back up in your life and turns out to be real. "I am sorry," she said, touching her face. "Don't be," he said, and he pulled her in and held her, and she held him back with her arms around his neck and her face in the warm wool of his collar, and the fire in the stove did what fire does. They were married on the 23rd of December, 1882, in Dalton Flats, in the office of the Justice of the Peace, whose name was Henderson, and who was a lean, spare man with spectacles and a deep appreciation for simplicity, which matched the occasion. Olive wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she had mended properly at the hem, and which suited her coloring so well that Oliver stood in the doorway of the Justice's office and watched her walk toward him, and had to make a deliberate effort to close his mouth. The witnesses were Sam Heller from the livery, who had sold Oliver the horse and felt a proprietary interest in how that had turned out, and Mrs. Gracie Tillman, who ran the general store and post office, and who had told 3 separate women over the years that Oliver Walker would come back around eventually if you gave him enough time, and who was pleased to have been proved right in her estimation of the man. Henderson read the words and they said what needed to be said, and when he pronounced them, married Oliver took Olive's face in his hands and kissed her in front of Sam Heller and Gracie Tillman and the Justice of the Peace, and through the window several people on the street of Dalton Flats who had stopped to watch, and Olive laughed against his mouth and said, "We have an audience," and he said, "Let them watch," which was the most Oliver Walker had ever said about what other people thought of him. And it was about right. Gracie Tillman had made a wedding supper of sorts. She had put on a small table in the back of the store with a real tablecloth and a roast chicken and a dried fruit cake that was better than it had any right to be, and the 4 of them ate it together, and Sam Heller made a toast with the good whiskey he had brought in from his coat pocket, and Oliver Walker laughed twice and meant it both times. And Olive sat next to him with her hand in his and her ring catching the lamplight, and felt that the world had arranged itself correctly at last. They drove home in the wagon under a sky that was salted with stars, and so cold the air hurt to breathe, wrapped in 2 blankets and sitting close. Dust had been left at the ranch and was waiting on the porch, and expressed his displeasure at the duration of the absence through the medium of immediate and extensive wriggling. Hazel nickered from the corral when she heard them. Oliver built up the fire in the stove, and the cabin was warm by the time they had seen to the horses. And in the warm room with the fire going and the stars outside the window, and the first night of a life that was going to be something other than what had come before, Oliver Walker looked at Olive Walker now, though she had said she liked the double O of it, Olive and Oliver, and she said it sounded like something that was meant to be together, and she looked back at him. And there was nothing in that look that was careful or held back or latched from the inside. The winter was the longest and the best he had ever spent. They worked the ranch together through January and February with the cold at its most serious, the mountains white to their lower slopes, and the nights so long they had real evenings, real time that wasn't just the gap between exhaustion and sleep. They read aloud to each other by the stove, Dickens and then a Walter Scott that she had found in the bottom of the book crate. And then Oliver went to Gracie Tillman's store and asked about whatever else she had and came back with 2 more, because it turned out the winters were better with a second voice. They talked about everything. Her years in Abilene, his years in Virginia before he came west, the nature of cattle prices and the state of New Mexico Territory politics, which were dramatic enough to be entertaining even at a distance. They argued once seriously about the best method for managing the herd through a late cold snap, and both of them were right about part of it and both were wrong about part of it, and it resolved the way good arguments resolve, with both people having learned something and neither feeling that they had been entirely defeated. She planted a kitchen garden in February, when the soil could first be turned at the edge of the south wall where it caught the most afternoon sun. She started the seeds in shallow boxes on the windowsill, and the cabin had green things growing in it through February and into March, small and determined, pushing up through the dark soil in the boxes with the energy of something that knows what it is supposed to be. Oliver watched the seeds come up and did not say anything about what it meant to him, because some things don't need to be said to be understood, and Olive understood it. In the spring, there was a letter from Oliver's mother in Virginia. He read it at the kitchen table, and then he read it again, and then he said, without looking up, "She says she is glad." "That you are well," Olive said. "That I have made good use of the ring," he said. He looked up then, and his expression was the open one, the one that she thought of as the real one, the one that had been locked away for 8 years and had come out gradually like a person coming inside from the cold by degrees, warming back to life. He said, "I want to write to her. I want her to know you." "I would like that," Olive said. She sat down across from him, and they composed the letter together, taking turns with what to say, and it was the kind of letter that people keep in a box for a long time afterward. By April, the ranch was running better than it had in years. The Renner dispute was settled and forgotten. The pastures were green from a good winter, and the herd was at a size that made the market situation manageable. There was money coming in regularly, and the life of the ranch had a shape to it that was whole in every direction. And in April, Olive told Oliver that they were going to be more than two. She told him in the morning, before chores, at the kitchen table with the coffee going. She said it simply, because she did not know another way to say things that were important, and she watched his face. He sat very still for a moment. The stillness was not fear, or not only fear, but the particular stillness of a person who has just been given something so large, they have to hold still to take its full weight. Then he got up and came around the table and went down on one knee on the kitchen floor and put his arms around her, his face against her side, and held on. She put her hand on his hair. She felt him breathe. "Oliver," she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were bright. "I know what happened before," she said gently. "I know what you are afraid of." "Yes," he said. "We are going to be careful," she said. "We are going to get the doctor from Socorro months ahead of time, and we are not going to leave things to chance. This is not 1874, and I am going to be all right." He looked at her for a long time, reading her face with the seriousness of a man who needs to believe something completely. "Tell me you are going to be all right," he said. "I am going to be all right," she said. "And we are going to have a child, and the child is going to grow up here in this valley, and you are going to build it a room and make it a bed, and I am going to plant it a garden, and everything is going to be as it should be." He nodded. He stood up and held her face in his hands carefully, as though she were something precious, which she was. "I am not afraid," he said. He was still afraid, but he was not only afraid, the other thing was bigger. Olive Walker's pregnancy through the summer and fall of 1883 was careful and tended, and surrounded by everything Oliver could think to do, which was quite a lot, since he had an excellent practical mind, and applied it fully to the problem of making sure she was safe and comfortable, and did not overwork herself, which she found occasionally maddening but understood. Gracie Tillman came out to the ranch several times during the summer with advice and company, because she had delivered a number of children in her years in Dalton Flats, and was not going to stay in town pretending this wasn't happening. Oliver's mother, receiving the news in a long letter, wrote back with the warmth of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this, and was prepared to travel if needed. Oliver wrote back to say not yet, but perhaps in the spring. The doctor from Socorro, a serious young man named Dr. Caleb Marsh, who had trained in St. Louis and had come west for reasons he didn't elaborate on, came to examine Olive in July, and pronounced her healthy and the pregnancy progressing normally, and said he would be back in October, and to send for him the moment there was any sign. Oliver wrote down the instructions with more thoroughness than the doctor had perhaps intended, covering 3 pages with notes, and Dr. Marsh looked at the 3 pages and then at Oliver Walker and then back at the 3 pages and said, "You are going to be a very thorough father." "I intend to be," Oliver said. The child was born on the 16th of November, 1883, 13 months after Olive first knocked on Oliver Walker's door. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and Dr. Marsh was there, and Gracie Tillman was there, and Oliver was outside the door and came in when Gracie called him, and Olive was exhausted and bright-eyed and holding a small, red, angry boy who had his father's dark hair and his mother's expression of absolute certainty about what he wanted. Oliver looked at his son, and something in him, the last locked room, the deepest closed thing, the grief that had sat at the center of him for 9 years opened. Not disappeared. Opened. It made room. It had room for this. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Olive put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time, and his face was absolutely undone. All the careful, managed expression dissolved into something that was just a man, just this, just now. "Hello," he said to the baby very quietly. He has your hair, Olive said. He has your forehead, Oliver said. He has your chin. He has your stubbornness, Oliver said. He has been arguing with the world for the last 3 hours. Olive laughed, tired and real. What do we call him? They had talked about names. They had talked about a great many names in the evenings by the stove, going back and forth with the casual pleasure of two people who enjoy disagreeing about small things because they agree about everything large. James, Oliver said. He looked at her. James William Walker. William for your father, she said. And James for yours, he said, if you'll allow it. She looked at him, at Oliver Walker, who had listened when she talked about her father and remembered the name she had said once, in passing, and held it for months until there was a use for it, and her eyes filled up again, the quiet kind of crying that meant too much and not too little. James William Walker, she said. Yes. Oliver's mother arrived in February of 1884. Her name was Margaret Walker, and she was 61 years old, small and upright, with Oliver's gray-dark coloring and the manner of a woman who has survived enough to have earned a clear view of things. She came by train to Albuquerque, and then by stage to Dalton Flats, and arrived in the late afternoon of a cold, clear day, and Oliver met her at the stage and brought her home to the cabin. Olive was waiting on the porch with James on her hip, James at 3 months, already substantial and opinionated, and Margaret Walker came down from the wagon and walked up the path and stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked at her daughter-in-law and her grandson. And then she looked at her son, who was standing behind her with his hands in his coat pockets and the most peaceful expression she had seen on his face in 9 years. Well, Margaret said. She climbed the porch steps and took the baby from Olive's arms with the authority of someone who had earned this exact right, and looked at James for a long moment with her eyes going bright. Then she looked at Olive. You are exactly as he described. What did he describe? Olive said. Capable, Margaret said. Direct, beautiful. He said beautiful, Olive said, turning to look at Oliver. I may have said something to that effect, Oliver said from the bottom of the porch steps, looking exactly as though he had not meant to admit that. Margaret Walker smiled, the smile of a woman whose faith in her son has been vindicated in full, and carried her grandson into the warm cabin. Margaret stayed for 6 weeks, which was the correct amount of time, long enough to be useful, and to know her grandson, and to sit by the stove with Olive in the evenings, and tell her things about Oliver as a boy that made Olive laugh and made Oliver, when he overheard them, look pained in a deeply fond way. Short enough that when she left there were tears and promises and a standing invitation on both sides, and the road to the stage felt like it was in the right direction rather than away from something. The spring of 1884 was exceptional in the valley, good rain, green pasture, the creek running high and clean. The kitchen garden came up with the energy of a well-planned enterprise, and there were more jars of preserves by midsummer than there had ever been in the root cellar. And the herd was at its best size, and the prices were cooperating for once. And Oliver Walker sat on the porch on a June evening with James asleep in the crook of his arm, and watched the last of the light go off the mountains, and felt the specific fullness of a life that has been rebuilt from its own wreckage and is better, now, than it was before. Not in spite of what happened, but in some complicated way, because of all of it. Olive came out and sat beside him, and he shifted James and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the evening was warm, and the coyote started up far away in the hills, and she did not flinch, which he had known she wouldn't. I was thinking, she said. About what? About the first night, she said. I was so certain you were going to tell me to leave. I had rehearsed what I was going to say if you did. I had a whole speech about being willing to sleep in the barn. You told me that, he said. About the barn. Yes, but I was ready for you to say no even to that, and I was going to argue about it, she said. I had a whole argument prepared. What was the argument? I was going to tell you that a woman who could do what I could do was better in your barn than riding 7 more miles in the dark on a bad ankle, and that if you sent me away and something happened to me on the road it would be partly your responsibility. She paused. It was not a very good argument. It was a reasonable argument, he said, "But you didn't make me use it," she said. "You just said come inside." "Yes," he said. "And then you lit the fire," she said. He was quiet for a moment, listening to the coyotes and the creek and the breathing of his son sleeping in his arm. "I lit the fire," he said. "I didn't think about it, I just did it." "Why?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking, the way she always asked things she actually wanted to know. "Because you were cold," he said, "and because you were there, and because," he stopped and thought about how to say it honestly, "because some things know what they are before you do." Olive looked at him, and then she looked at the mountains, and then she looked at her ring on her hand in the fading light. "That is the most poetic thing you have ever said," she said. "Don't tell anyone," he said. "I have a reputation to maintain." She laughed, and James stirred at the sound of it and then settled back. And the evening came all the way down, and the first stars appeared over the mountains, and the lamp in the window made a yellow square of warmth in the growing dark. And Oliver Walker and Olive Walker sat on the porch of the house he had built, and she had come back to life inside, and were complete. The second year of their marriage continued with the richness that comes when two people stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and simply live. Oliver expanded the north pasture fence and hired on a young hand, a 20-year-old named Rafael Vega, whose family had been in the territory for generations, and who knew the land and the cattle better than Oliver had expected and learned the rest within a month. Rafael ate supper at the ranch house twice a week and considered Olive Walker's cooking to be among the finer things the territory had to offer, which she found flattering and Oliver found entirely correct. James Walker, at 1 year old, was a person with a clear and detailed opinion about everything. He was loud, interested in all objects regardless of their intended purpose, deeply attached to Dust the dog, and showed an early aptitude for walking into things he had been specifically warned about. He had Olive's eyes and Oliver's determination, and the particular energy of a child who has been loved from the beginning without reservation. In the fall of 1884, Oliver and Olive went together to the south side of the property, to the juniper tree with the two small crosses. Oliver had been there alone many times over the years. It was part of the upkeep that he had never let go, the clearing of debris, the straightening of the wood. But he had not brought anyone there, not in 8 years, not since his mother had stood there at the burial and then left. He brought Olive now. They stood side by side under the tree in the October afternoon, James on Oliver's hip, and Oliver was quiet for a while in the way that he was quiet about important things, the way that took up all the available air. Then he said, "Clara Walker, my wife. She died in July of 1874. The baby, we didn't name him before we knew, after I called him William in my head, William Walker." Olive stood beside him and listened, and then she reached over and took his hand. "You have been caring for them all this time," she said. "It seemed like the least I could do," he said. "It was not the least," she said. "It was the most. It was the most a person can do." She looked at the crosses. "I am glad to know them, by name." Oliver looked at the graves, and then at the woman beside him and the son in his arms. And the thing in his chest that had been a wound for so long was, in this moment, completely a scar, permanent and present and no longer bleeding, a part of him that had made him who he was, which was a man standing in the autumn light with his family. He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back. "Thank you," he said. He was not sure precisely what he was thanking her for. Everything, possibly, the whole of it. "Thank you," she said back, which covered the same territory. They walked back to the cabin in the long-angled afternoon light, and Raphael was already seeing to the evening chores, and dusk came bounding across the yard to meet them with the undifferentiated enthusiasm that was his permanent condition. And James laughed at him and reached down toward him, and Oliver held his son securely and let him pet the dog's rough red head. Inside, Olive began supper, and Oliver put James down on the blanket spread on the kitchen floor and lit the stove, and the room filled with warmth, and the smell of the cedar smoke mixed with the smell of whatever she was making, which involved onions and something savory, and the lamp was lit as the dark came down. This was what it was. A warm room and the fire going, and two people who knew each other well enough to be silent together and loved each other enough to not be silent when it mattered. A child on the floor reaching for the dog, the stove doing its steady work. The mountains outside the window, dark and permanent, indifferent to everything except the weather they made, which was fine with everyone. In the winter of 1885, Oliver received a letter from the county offices in Santa Fe regarding the formal homestead registration of his land. The territory was changing, more settlement, more law, more of the official infrastructure that came when places got old enough to need it. The letter required certain documentation and a trip to the county offices, and Oliver made the trip in January, taking 2 days and coming back with the papers in order and a clearer title than he had started with. He also came back with 2 things he had acquired in Santa Fe. One was a bolt of good blue cloth that he had bought on impulse in a dry goods store, because it was the exact color of the dress Olive had been wearing the night she knocked on his door. And he did not explain this to her, but simply put it on the kitchen table, and she looked at it, and then at him, and understood it completely. The other thing was a small framed photograph. A photographer in Santa Fe had a studio, and Oliver had stopped in on the way back and had his portrait taken, a formal thing with a serious face, which was not his best face but was the face he made when someone pointed a camera at him. He gave it to her when he got back and said, "For your mother, if she would like it." "Or for the mantelpiece." Olive looked at the photograph for a long time, then she set it on the mantelpiece. "It looks like you," she said. "It is supposed to," he said, "but it doesn't have the—" She touched the corner of her mouth, indicating the almost smile. "It needs the thing you do here." "I was told to look serious," he said. "You are always serious," she said. "The smile is the serious part. The smile is you taking something seriously enough to be glad about it." He looked at her. Then he picked up the photograph and looked at it and set it back down. "Next time I will argue with the photographer," he said. She stood on her toes and kissed him on the jaw and went back to the stove, and he stood by the mantelpiece for a moment longer, looking at the photograph and then at the room, the fire, the lamp, the blanket on the floor with the rings and blocks James had been playing with, the blue cloth on the table, the woman at the stove, and thought that if someone had told him in 1882 that this was what was coming, he would not have believed them. Not because he didn't want it, but because he had stopped thinking wanting had anything to do with what actually arrived. He had been wrong about that. What arrived was sometimes exactly what was needed, and it arrived in the shape of a woman with muddy boots and a canvas bag, and a voice that said, "I am not asking for charity," in the dark on his porch in October. And he had opened the door and lit the fire, and nothing had been the same since. James Walker took his first full steps at 13 months, lurching across the kitchen floor from the chair leg to his mother's hands, with the expression of someone discovering that the world is much more navigable than previously understood. Oliver was there for it. He had come in from the yard specifically because Olive had appeared in the door with a particular look on her face that said something was happening, and he stood with his shoulder against the door frame and watched his son walk, and the feeling was too large to have a single name, so he did not give it one. That evening, by the stove, he told her something he had not yet told her. He said, "I want you to know that I know what it cost you to knock on that door." She looked up from the shirt she was mending. "What do you mean?" "I know what it is to be at the end of something," he said. "No horse, no money, mud to the ankle, 7 miles from town in the dark. And you stood there and asked anyway, with your traveling bag at your feet. That took courage." She set down the shirt. "I had run out of choices," she said. "It was that or sleep under the sage." "No," he said. "It takes courage even when you've run out of choices. Maybe especially then. I want you to know I understand that." He paused. "And I want you to know that I am glad you ran out of choices at my door and not someone else's." Olive Alden Walker looked at her husband in the firelight and thought that he had gotten considerably better at saying things since the night she had arrived, and that this was one of the finer things about living with a person who takes things seriously. They take the good things seriously too, not just the hard ones. So am I, she said. She picked up the shirt and went back to mending, and he went back to whatever he was reading. And the stove was warm, and the baby was asleep, and the dog was under the table, and the world outside was cold and enormous and entirely manageable from where they sat. The years built on each other the way good years do, each one adding something without taking from what came before. By 1887, the Walker Ranch was one of the better-run operations in the Dalton Flats area, not the largest but the most consistent, with a reputation for good beef and reliable contracts. Rafael Vega had become essential and had been given a raise and a small house at the edge of the property that Oliver had helped him build. And Raphael had, with some color in his expression, mentioned that he was thinking of asking a woman in town to marry him, and Olive had told him to stop thinking about it and do it. And he had. And the woman, a dark-eyed young woman named Catalina who made the best tamales anyone at the ranch had ever eaten, had said yes. The Vega household added a lively dimension to the operation that everyone agreed improved it. James was 3 in 1886 and 4 in 1887, and was, by general agreement in Dalton Flats, the most definitively himself of any child currently in the valley. He had opinions about horses and dogs, and the proper method of stacking firewood, and the question of whether beans were an acceptable supper item. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, and the combined stubbornness of two very determined people, which was considerable. In the winter of 1887, Olive told Oliver that James was going to have a brother or a sister. "Which do you think?" he said. He was better at this now, not the fear exactly gone, but managed, held in its proper proportion by the fact that the first time had ended in the right direction, and she was strong and the doctor was good, and they were not, as she had said, in 1874 anymore. "I have no idea," she said. "I thought it might be a boy last time too." "You thought it was a boy? I had a feeling." "You were right," he said. "I know," she said, "but I don't trust the feeling." The second child was born in July of 1887, in the full heat of the summer, in the bedroom of the cabin, with the windows open to whatever breeze was available, and Dr. Marsh present and Gracie Tillman present, and Oliver outside the door doing what fathers do outside doors, which is try not to think and fail completely. The child was a girl. Oliver came in when Gracie called him, and Olive was there against the pillows with the same bright, exhausted look she had the first time, and in her arms was a small girl with a remarkable quantity of red dark hair, which nobody had anticipated, and a face of absolute serenity, which was startling given the circumstances of her arrival. "Hello," said Oliver, sitting on the edge of the bed. "She is very calm," Olive said. "I do not know where she gets it." "Not from either of us," Oliver agreed. They named her Clara. It was Olive who suggested it, simply looking at the ceiling of the bedroom in the hours after the birth, when things had quieted. "Clara," she said, "if you think it is right." Oliver was quiet for a moment that was very full. Then he said, "It is right. She deserves to be remembered in a living thing," Olive said, "not just the grave." "Yes," he said. He took his wife's hand in the dim summer bedroom, and the baby Clara slept between them, calm and red-haired and entirely at home in the world. James, when introduced to his sister the next morning, regarded her with the evaluative seriousness of a 4-year-old who has not previously been required to share his household with someone smaller than himself. "She is very small," he said. "She will get bigger," Olive said. "Can she walk?" "Not yet." "Can she talk?" "Not yet." James appeared to consider this. "She cannot do anything," he said. "She can do a great deal," Oliver said from the doorway. "She can be Clara Walker." "That is not a small thing." James looked at his father with the expression of a child storing information for later use, and then reached out and very gently, with one finger, touched his sister's hand, and Clara's fingers curled around it with the grip that newborns have, unconscious and complete. And James looked up with an expression that was entirely new, wondering and soft and already changed. "Oh," he said. "Yes," said Oliver. The summer of 1887 settled into the full richness of what the Walker Ranch had become. The two children in the yard in the evenings, James already following his father through the chores with the serious application of someone who intends to learn everything as fast as possible. Clara in the shade with Olive, or with Gracie Tillman when she came visiting. The whole operation running with the smoothness of a thing that has been cared for and built well. Oliver Walker had come to this valley in 1874 with a wife and a hope, and had stayed through the death of the hope and built the life anyway, built it down to its bones, kept the graves and fixed the fence posts and let the cold in, and had been, for 8 years, a man who was alive and nothing more than alive. And then someone had knocked on his door. He was in the habit now of sitting on the porch in the evenings after supper when the day was good enough for it, and watching the mountains go through their colors gold and red and deep purple, and then the settled dark, and the coyotes starting up, and the stars coming out one by one over the ridge. He had James beside him sometimes, falling asleep against his arm, and sometimes Clara in his lap, and sometimes just the dog, and sometimes Olive came out, and they sat together in the chair and porch step configuration they had developed over the years, her in the chair and him on the step, or both on the step if the evening called for it. He was sitting alone one such evening in the October of 1887, with Clara asleep inside, and James asleep on the cot in the corner of the main room, and Olive finishing the last of something in the kitchen, and the mountains were going through their final colors, when Olive came out and sat beside him and put her head against his shoulder. They were quiet for a while, the specific companionable quiet that they had developed over 5 years of evenings, which was not silence but inhabited space, full of everything that had been said and did not need saying again. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "The night you arrived," he said. "I think about that too," she said. "What do you think about it?" "I think about how cold I was," she said, "and how I could see the light in the window from the road, and I told myself it probably wasn't a kind person, and I had to stop assuming that lights in windows meant safety. And then I knocked anyway," she said, "because I was cold and my ankle hurt and I had been walking for 4 hours and a barn was better than the sage." "A barn," he said. "I thought I was getting a barn," she said, "at best. You got better than a barn." "I did," she said. She laced her fingers through his. "Considerably." The mountains were fully dark now. The stars salted in across the whole of the sky the way they are in country where there are no other lights to compete with them. And the coyotes were singing far away in the hills, and the creek moved over its stones in the middle distance, and the cabin behind them was warm and lit and full of sleeping children. Oliver Walker turned and kissed his wife's hair, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and they sat in the October evening in the high desert of New Mexico Territory in the year 1887, in a life that had been built from nothing and loss and stubbornness, and the particular grace of two people who had recognized each other without intending to. The stove was going inside. He had not lit it for company in 8 years, and then he had, and it had never gone cold since. It never would. 5 years after the children were born, in the spring of 1892, Olive Walker found a letter from a woman she had not expected to hear from, the wife of Thomas Alden's brother, a woman named Ruth who had been kind to Olive in the difficult months after Thomas died, and then faded back into the distance that the Alden family had always maintained with the branch of it that had gone west. Ruth wrote to say that she had heard Olive was well and settled, which she had heard from someone who had been through Dalton Flats, and she was glad, and she hoped Olive was happy, and she thought Thomas would have been glad too. Olive sat at the kitchen table with the letter and read it twice, and Oliver came in from the yard and found her there and sat across from her and waited. "An old letter," she said. "Nothing bad, something from before." "Does it need anything?" he said. "It needs answering," she said. "Kindly." He nodded. He got up and put the coffee on, because that was what you did, and she folded the letter and sat back and looked around the kitchen, the jars in the window. The blue cloth curtain she had made from the bolt Oliver brought from Santa Fe and replaced twice since. The photographs now on the mantelpiece, including one taken 2 years before of the four of them together, and the children's drawings tacked to the door frame. And all of it so far from the woman who had walked 7 miles on a bad ankle in the October dark. And she thought about Ruth's last line, which was that Thomas would have been glad. She believed that. Thomas had been a good man who wanted her to be happy, and had done his best to make her so, and had simply run out of time to do it. She had been 25 when he died, and she had been bereft, and she had learned in the 2 years after that grief and forward motion are not mutually exclusive, that you can carry something and still walk, and that sometimes the walking is the thing that makes the carrying bearable. She had walked 7 miles on a bad ankle in the October dark, and she had knocked on the door of a man who had been carrying his own grief for 8 years, and he had opened the door and lit the fire, and she had stopped walking. She wrote to Ruth that evening, with Oliver reading at the table beside her, and she wrote about Dalton Flats and the ranch and Oliver and James and Clara and Hazel and Dust, who was getting elderly but was still the most opinionated dog in the territory. And she wrote that yes, she was happy, and that Thomas would have understood what that meant and been glad of it, just as Ruth said. She sealed the letter and put it on the table to go out with the morning mail, and Oliver looked up from his book and said, all right, she said, better then. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment, and she turned her hand over and held it. And the lamp was warm, and the stove was going, and the children were asleep, and the dog was under the table, and the night was clear and cold outside, and the mountains were permanent in the dark. Dalton Flats grew, in the years that followed, as New Mexico territory moved toward the statehood that was still 20 years away, but was already feeling inevitable more settlers coming through, the railroad spur getting closer, the town adding a proper schoolhouse in 1888 and a church in 1890, and a doctor's office in 1891 when Dr. Marsh finally made the decision to settle there permanently rather than continue the long ride from Socorro. James Walker was in the first class at the schoolhouse, and Clara Walker 2 years behind him, and both of them were noted by the teacher, a young woman from Cincinnati named Miss Porter, as children who were thoroughly interested in the world and thoroughly capable of expressing that interest at volume. Oliver expanded the herd in 1889 and added 2 more hands, both young men from the territory, both recommended by Rafael Vega, and the ranch operation had by 1890 become something that a man could be proud of without overstatement. A real working enterprise, sustainable and sound, the kind of place that would last. He had once built it as something to survive inside. He had come to think of it now as something to give forward. James came with him on the full rounds of the property by the time he was 7, asking questions with the relentless precision of a child who intends to understand everything, and Oliver answered every question with equal seriousness, the way his own father had answered his. Clara, at 3 and 4 and 5, was her own particular creature entirely. The red dark hair and the calm that had startled them both at her birth, which turned out to be genuine, a quality of steady warmth that she carried through everything, not passive but centered, a child who seemed to arrive at peace with things slightly faster than anyone around her. She was interested in the garden and the horses and the dog and the baby chicks in the spring, and she had a way with the animals that Olive said was entirely Oliver, and Oliver said was entirely Olive, and Rafael Vega said was entirely Clara, which was probably the truest answer. The October of 1892 came around 10 years after the night Olive had knocked on the door, and Olive marked it privately, not with ceremony, just with the noting of it, the way you note the anniversary of a thing that changed everything. She was at the kitchen table in the morning when she noticed it, counting the year, and she sat with her coffee and looked at the stove that was going because October mornings in the valley were cold now, and thought about the version of herself who had stood on the porch with muddy boots and a canvas bag, and not very much left except stubbornness and the willingness to knock. Oliver came in from the morning chores and poured his coffee and looked at her and said, "What is it?" 10 years ago today," she said. "Give or take a few days." He sat down. He was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a man processing something that matters. "I have been trying to remember," he said, "what I was doing that day before you knocked." "Cold biscuits," she said. "You told me once." "Cold biscuits," he said, "and I was looking at the stove." He paused. "I remember that. I was looking at the stove and thinking about whether it was worth the trouble. And then I knocked," she said. "And then you knocked," he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the morning light. 10 years of days between them and in front of them. The stove going behind her, and the coffee hot, and the children still asleep, and the whole living present of the life they had made arranged around them like a room built with good hands and enough time. "It was worth the trouble," he said. Olive Walker put her coffee down and reached across the table and held his face in her hands, the way he had held hers on the night she said yes, and looked at him directly, with all the things that 10 years of being known by someone give you access to. "It was worth everything," she said. He covered her hands with his. Outside, the October morning was going gold over the mountains, and the creek was running, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture, and somewhere in the house James was waking up and beginning to make the sounds of a 10-year-old who has things he needs to be doing. And Clara's door would open in a few minutes, and she would come padding into the kitchen in her bare feet with her red dark hair in all directions, and climb into Oliver's lap without asking, the way she always did. And he would put his arm around her, and she would lean against him, and that would be that. The stove would keep going, as it had for 10 years without interruption, for a man who had learned that the fire you light for someone else is also the fire that keeps you warm, and that sometimes the simplest movement, a match to the kindling, a door swung open, a hand held out, is the whole of the story. Oliver Walker had not lit the stove for company in 8 years. And then he had, and the cold had never entirely come back, and the life that had been hollow had filled up so completely that he could not have told you now where the empty space had been, only that it wasn't there anymore, only that the room was warm and the woman was here and the children were waking up and the morning was coming through the window and the mountains were standing where they had always stood, and all of it, every bit of it, was exactly as it should be.